tonight in Daniel chapter 5. We're starting in verse 17. We're going to get through all the way through 31, the end of chapter 5. But we'll take verses 17 through 23 first. Okay? So let's read 17 through 23. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Keep your gifts for yourself, or give the rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father." Remember, as I said last week, there is no Aramaic word for grand. So no matter what generation you are, you're still of your father. You may be the first generation of your father, or second generation of your father, or third generation of your father. That's the way they say it. It's said in Aramaic, okay? Verse 19, "And because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him," that is Nebuchadnezzar, "all the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished he killed, whomever he wished he spared alive, whomever he wished he elevated, and whomever he wished he humbled. But when his heart was so lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beasts, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys." Now, there's an interesting element that we didn't learn previously. So, he was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. By the way, Norm, that's what we're going to discuss tonight, because that's the thing, of course, that no empire seems to learn.
21 at the very end.
21 at the very end. Verse 22, "Yet you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and have brought the vessels of his house before you, you and your nobles. Your wives and your concubines have been drinking wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and of gold, of bronze, of iron, of wood and stone, which do not see, nor hear, nor understand. But the God in whose hand are your life breath," which is really an interesting way to put it, based on what you're going to see in a minute, "in whose hand are your life breath, and your ways have you not glorified." Okay? Now, of course, we realize that there is this hand that inscribed something on the plaster wall, on one of the walls, in the palace banquet room. And of course, as we said last week, Belshazzar had a very interesting reaction to it. Okay? To put it bluntly, he pooped his pants. That's what happened. Okay?
Is that when they invented diapers? Or?
He needed them. Literally in the Aramaic, that's what it said. Okay?
Seriously?
Oh, yes.
Oh my gosh.
So,
I thought you were making it up.
no.
All right.
Okay. So, they all see this. They're beyond shocked that this hand, no arm, just a hand with fingers, writes these words on the wall. Now, Daniel, after he's called to come and interpret, okay, someone finally pulls him out of the closet somewhere. I think he's been in mothballs for a while. Now remember, Daniel's has to be about 85 years old at this point. All right, so he may have retired from active service a while back, but they finally go, there is this guy, and he's done this before, and he seems to understand these things. Maybe we better go get him. So they went and got him. Now, I'm calling this section, if you'll notice, the sermon, because this is Daniel's sermon to Belshazzar. And he pulls no punches whatsoever in what he says to this man. It's in your face statements, okay? So Daniel rejects the presents that are offered if he will interpret these words. Why? Because he isn't going to give the impression that they could purchase an interpretation from him. Plus, he doesn't need anything that they offer from him. And he doesn't want this to appear somehow as a parlor trick. Now, Daniel knew something that these guys didn't. Yes. Well, he knew something else too. Let me show you what Daniel knew. And I'll guarantee you he knew it. Turn to 2 Chronicles, chapter 36. Remember, we have several references that indicate Daniel studying the scriptures. Well, here's one he knew. It's the last chapter of 2 Chronicles. And we're going to read verses 20 and 21. And those who had escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon. And they were servants to him and to his sons, to him, Nebuchadnezzar, and to his sons, and to the rule of the kingdom of Persia. Verse 21. To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths, literally, it's Shabuim, it's 77s, okay? Remember, they did not follow the principle of the Shemitah. They didn't do what they were told to do every seventh year for 490 years. So God said, you're in the penalty box. 1 year for every 7 years you didn't do it. And look what it says then. All the days of its desolation, it kept Sabbath until 70 years were complete. Therefore, Daniel knew. What?
It was time for Jews to go home.
He knew that it was very close to the 70th year. He knew when he came. He knew how old he was. He knew how long he'd been there. He knew it was only going to last 70 years. So when he's called in, he's not surprised that this event is taking place. All right? Also, if you turn over to your right, going back towards Daniel, but stop in Jeremiah first, in chapter 25, we'll see another thing that Daniel knew. It's similar. It's Jeremiah 25, verse 11. It says, and this whole land shall be a desolation and a horror, that is Israel. And these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. So, when Daniel comes in this room, he's not surprised at all. Okay? So he doesn't want this to look like some parlor trick that Belshazzar is paying him to accomplish. So he refuses and says, literally, take your you-know-what and give it to someone else. I'm not interested. Okay? Now, he reminds Belshazzar that it was God who made Nebuchadnezzar, his grandfather, great. It was God that gave him power. It was God that gave him authority. It was God that gave him control over the realm. It was God that created the majesty that Nebuchadnezzar helped create in Babylon and the grandeur of the city. And of course, he tells Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar became very puffed up about all this, and so God had him on a 7-year plan. And we know what that 7-year plan was. Until, of course, at the end of the 7 years, he finally says that he accepts in humility the rulership of the God of heaven and earth, and then was restored back to being the king, and probably lived about 2 more years, we think, after that.
He had his fill of grass.
Yeah, apparently so. 7 years was enough. Now, I wrote it this way, and I think it's a fair way to put the tone of the language. He basically looks at Belshazzar and says, son, you heard all about this from your relatives, but you didn't listen to any of it. In other words, Belshazzar had to have known, you know. He had to have known from his mother. He had to have known from his father. He had to probably known from his grandmother, who we think.
He doesn't tell the whole family when their grandpa went out in
Yeah,
for
for 7 years. Okay, I mean this is not a state secret. Okay, what happened? And so he says, you knew, but you didn't listen. He tells Belshazzar several things about his own character, which we'll get into more. And of course, one of them we learn from history is that Belshazzar was an arrogant tyrant. But Belshazzar was even worse in his arrogance than Nebuchadnezzar, in that he dared not commit one incredible affront, an offense to God. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar didn't dare commit what Belshazzar did. And that, of course, is taking the elements from the temple service and having a wild sex orgy drunken party with them, which is exactly what was going on. And so, of course, we see that he commits a sin that seals his fate. Now, let me show you. I don't want to go into a lot of verses here, but why don't you turn from Jeremiah? Why don't you turn back to Isaiah, just back one book, and go to chapter 26. I think this verse is very apt in this place. Isaiah 26, verse 10. Though the wicked is shown favor, he does not learn righteousness. He deals unjustly in the land of uprightness and does not perceive the majesty of the Lord. Now there's a fair description of the behavior of Belshazzar. It's what Isaiah says about those who rule wickedly. And of course, Belshazzar did. Now, it's always interesting to pull some of the secular historians and their writings to kind of help, see more broadly what's going on. Our view of this scripture is really the view of the room. And to some extent, a little bit of knowledge of what was going on outside the walls. But primarily it's focused on what's going on inside the room. But other historians, of course, wrote about this. Xenophon describes Belshazzar in his writings as, quote, an impious man who killed people out of jealousy and for the most minor slight. Apparently there was one time where one of his wives or concubines looked at one of his staff members in a way that he thought was inappropriate and immediately had that guy killed. Okay? I mean, he just was impulsively vicious as you read about him. Also, the term that Xenophon refers to him as, he calls him Belshazzar the Ungodly. That's his phrase of him. Now, we know from both Xenophon and Herodias that by 546 BC, under the rulership and the corruption that was going on with Belshazzar, that the corruption was rampant, the government was mismanaged, commerce was crumbling, famine was beginning to occur. And of course, ironically, we find that there's another event that occurs that Xenophon tells us about. The scripture doesn't tell us this, but several of the historians do. And that is that there was a man who was a famous general of the Babylonians named Gobryas. Okay? And Gobryas ended up about a couple years before defecting to the Medo-Persians. He changed his loyalty. He went over, and here's a fairly important person, and there's a reason why. The reason why he changed his loyalty and went over to the Medo-Persians is because Belshazzar, in one of his angry, impulsive moments, had one of Gobryas's relatives killed. And that was about enough for Gobryas. Now think of the implications. Here's a military general of Babylon that goes over to the Medo-Persians. I'm certain he had a lot of information to bring them. Okay? And that's what happened.
Sound like Rudolph Hess when he went to Britain.
Yeah.
Same thing.
So everything in Babylon was going kind of downhill.
Yes. All the great achievements that Nebuchadnezzar had made in terms of commerce, virtually eliminating famine in the kingdom, increased trade, marketing of goods, all that during Belshazzar's reign just started to crumble. Turn to Job chapter 15. I think that, and again, if you're in Isaiah, or just keep going to the left, I think there's some verses here that are, there's a lot of wisdom in the book of Job. So we're going to go to Job 15, and we're going to start in verse 15. And notice what this is not Job speaking, this is one of his friends, Eliphaz, speaking. But look what he says, starting in verse 15. Behold, he puts no trust in his holy ones, and the heavens are not pure in his sight. How much less one who is detestable and corrupt, man who drinks iniquity like water. Now think of the image, drinks iniquity like water. I will tell you, listen to me, and what I have seen I will also declare. What wise men have told and have not concealed from their fathers, to whom alone the land was given, and no alien passed among them. The wicked man writhes in pain all his days. Now, catch the next words. And numbered are the years stored up for his ruthlessness. You're going to see how that plays real quickly. Sounds of terror in his ears. Well, at peace, the destroyer comes upon him. He does not believe that he will return from darkness, and he's destined for the sword. You realize when Belshazzar was killed? That very night.
Yeah.
That very night he dies. Okay? He wanders about for food, saying, where is it? He knows that a day of darkness is at hand. Distress and anguish terrify him. They overpower him like a king ready for the attack, because he has stretched out his hand against God and conducts himself arrogantly against the Almighty. That's a pretty fair description of what was going on with Belshazzar here, isn't it?
Fits the pattern of people that came after.
Oh, yes. It fits the pattern of many people.
Yes, regardless.
Now, also, you might go to your right from Job back over to Isaiah chapter 5. There's another thing that Isaiah says that I think is very applicable too. Starting in verse 11, just verses 11 and 12 of Isaiah 5. Woe to those who rise early in the morning that they may pursue strong drink. Okay? Who stay up late in the evening that wine may inflame them. And their banquets are accompanied by lyre and harp, by tambourine and flute, and by wine. But they do not pay attention to the deeds of the Lord, nor do they consider the work of his hands. And that's pretty descriptive of what was going on with Belshazzar too.
Hardy.
Yes.
I was going to say, it sounds like today's, really.
Well, yeah, that's what we're going to talk about later. Because, there is no,
That's that question.
it's, again, the old saying by Mark Twain, history may not repeat itself, but it sure does seem to rhyme. And it does. Now let's read back to Daniel Let's read the next set of verses in Daniel 5. Let's read verses 24 through 29. Here's the part about the message. Then the hand was sent from him, and this inscription was written out. Now this is the inscription that was written out. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave orders that they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as third ruler in the kingdom. So let's look at these words. Now, the first thing I think we should ask ourselves is, why could these words not be understood by the people that were sitting in the room and looking at them? Obviously, they couldn't.
How drunk were they?
Well, there's a lot of things you could pose, but let me pose a couple, okay?
Hebrew.
Yeah. Now, of course, we know that Hebrew and Aramaic are related languages. They're not identical, but there's a lot of relation between them. It's possible that these words that God wrote on the wall were in Hebrew, but they were in code. Okay? In other words, the letters were not in their natural order that you would normally write Hebrew in. Now, the rabbis had two patterns to do this. One of them is called Albam, A-L-B-A-M. And what they do is they take the 22 letters of Hebrew and put them in two lines of 11, one on top of the other. Okay? And then you substitute the last character of line 2 for the first of line 1 as you write your message,
For what purpose?
as a code to make it more difficult for someone to understand what you're saying.
Like
This
food.
was a tradition of the rabbis. They would sometimes want something private that they were writing, so they'd use this code system to do it. All right. Now there's another option of this that they also used, which is called Atbash. And the reason why it's the alphabet, that's why we call them Atbash, or we call them Albam. It's taking four letters and the sounds of them in Hebrew, putting them together, okay? Atbash is when one reverses, again, you got two lines of 11 characters, one on top of the other, and one reverses the characters on line 2 and then substitutes them one for each character on line 1. It's another way to code. So it's possible, and no one knows for certain, but it's possible that God used this kind of rabbinic code when he wrote this on this wall so that they just couldn't understand it because they didn't know the code.
Mm-hmm.
Even though the letters, they may have known some of the letters, but they couldn't make any sense of it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? But of course, Daniel studied the scriptures. All right? Daniel studied. He knew Judaism. He was raised in it, and he would likely understand this. So let's go through these words. Mene, it means literally to count or number something, or specifically to count the days of something. It implies in it setting a fixed date or an end date. That's the implication of the word mene. Now, but then God wrote mene again, a second time. So there's a further emphasis and a double meaning because he wrote it twice. Not only was the kingdom going to be divided, okay, but the kingdom was going to be divided from its ruler. Belshazzar was toast. And that's probably why he said mene the second time. as a further emphasis. Now, tekel means to weigh out or assess something in the sense of it being short or lacking. The emphasis, there's an emphasis on evaluating, of course, therefore, both Belshazzar's and the others in the party, their behavior. Now, I want to show you some things about measuring. I want to show you a few verses. The first one I want to show you is in Job 31. Let's turn back to your left again, to Job. Job 31. Job has there's a lot of wisdom in the book of Job. Job 31, we're going to read verses 4 through 6. Does he not see my ways and number all my steps? If I have walked with falsehood, and my foot has hastened after deceit, let him weigh me with accurate scales, and let God know my integrity. So here's an interesting concept by Job about God weighing the actions of people. Job is probably the oldest book of the entire Bible. It's probably the first one that was actually written, as far as we can tell. Now let's look at the Psalm 62 next. So go to your right, and you just got to go one more book over to Psalm chapter 62. Psalm 62, and we're going to look at verses 9 and 10. He says, men of low degree are only vanity, and men of rank are a lie. Think about it. What does having rank tend to do over time?
First of all, you get the big head.
Yeah, right. So they puff up or think you're
And that's the
wonderful.
first problem that you get into.
Yep.
And then once they've got the big head, they think they got the authority to do everything
Yeah.
that they want to do purposely.
And whatever they say should go. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not, and they therefore lie. They deceive for their own political purposes. So look what he says. And men of rank are a lie. In the balances they go up. They are together lighter than breath. In other words, their importance and their future is easily determined if you see a balanced scale as God breathing on one end of the scale and them being on the other end. Okay? And guess which way it's going to tip. Okay? that's what he's literally saying in this verse. Very interesting, I think. Now, also, let's go to the very end. Let's go to one more place. Go to the book of Revelation, chapter 20, because we're talking about God evaluating, God weighing, God measuring people. And go to, just before the literal end of the Bible, go to chapter 20 of Revelation, and let's read 11 through 15. Here's a future weighing that's going to occur. Fortunately, we're going to be observing this one. We're not going to be part of this one. But it's going to be a big weighing session, okay? And I saw a great white throne and him who sat on it, from whose presence earth and heaven fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, literally, he calls these people the dead. In other words, everyone died, well, almost everyone dies once, but for Christians, you die once and you live forever. These people die twice. Their physical body dies, and then they go into eternal death. And I saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne. Books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. That's where our names are found, by the way. And the dead were judged from the things which are written in the books according to their deeds. And then he goes on and says that, when they are judged, then they will be condemned, and of course they will be sent to the second death, verse 14, that is the lake of fire. So God keeps a score. Yes.
There's also a verse in Proverbs. A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight.
Yeah. Right. And that.
Again, is that related?
It's not. It's related. Yes and no. It's another where God's saying, in the commercial sense, be just with your weighing. In other words, if what you're selling is you're charging by the pound or the ounce or whatever, grams, whatever, be just. But in the same way, there's a relationship in the sense that evaluation is a part of life. It's part of life. Did you ever get to school without evaluation? Did you ever get professional certification without evaluation? Evaluation is a part of life, and God also evaluates. Now, the next word that he uses is the word Perez, or Perez. There's many different forms of this word, by the way, but it means, in its most literal sense, to divide something in half. So we call this word paranomasia, which is Greek, which is a nice big word that means double meaning, paranomasia. Belshazzar's kingdom, of course, is divided from him, and is divided and given away. And who is it given to? The second double meaning is that it's given to the divided ones, the Media Persians. They're a divided group that becomes one kingdom. So Belshazzar's divided up and given to the divided ones. It's literally what he's saying here by using this word. The root word for this is parasat, and of course it can be written as Perez. There's lots of forms. There's a third form to this word parasat, which maybe isn't very obvious, but it's the last word in there, the upharsin. It also is a form of the word Perez. It has a particular meaning, though. It implies the finality and completion of what has already been decided. In other words, a sentence. That's what it really implies. So.
I had a question.
Yes.
It goes back to Revelation 11 through 15.
Okay.
And how it is stressed and what it presents. What do you see in relationship to those who profess to be Christians and don't do a darn thing that is relevant to Christianity, and they violate the rules and regulations that's in the book of Job? And
okay. If they truly are saved, if they've truly accepted Christ as their Savior, which if they have no fruit, we don't know, because the only thing we can see is fruit. Okay, so if they could have been saved, but absolutely never grew, and therefore never, in their behavior, acted like Christians, really, to speak of. But if indeed they were saved, they're not going to be part of this group. It's only the unsaved that are part of this group.
as follow-up, if you take the Scientology that's been on TV and the cults and those that are the leaders of those entities who profess their allegiance to Christ, where does the revelation? Scientology, the leaders of Scientology, the leaders of Mormons, all of those that profess it, but they don't do anything close.
Well, their problem with these groups, if you want to put it in seminary terms,
Sure.
is Christology. the person of Christ. That's their problem. Scientology never says that Jesus is the Christ, that he is the Savior of the world, that he died for all sins, that he is the only, the way, the truth, and the life. They never say it.
As well as Jehovah's Witnesses. They don't say that.
Yeah, Jehovah's Witnesses have a quasi-biblical appearance, but they do not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. They believe Jesus was a unique angel. Okay? So their Christology is so any group that has a distorted and inaccurate Christology, its followers are in great danger because they're not hearing the truth.
That's my point right there.
Right.
So when you look at Revelations and what you were going through, and those people, to me, they're not going to die once and be saved. They're going to die twice, and the second one is going to be holy hell.
Literally.
Literally.
Yeah, and you're right. And now it's interesting, I think, in cult groups, because some people, through some means, do seem to get saved, even in cult groups. Now, what that often leads to is them leaving the cult group, okay, because they can't tolerate being in it and advocating a different concept of the one they're told to believe. But God's mercy is everywhere. Whoever has an inkling of an interest, he will meet them in any way he has to meet them for them to come to know him. So,
for what you're teaching in regards to what's his name? Bella what?
Belshazzar.
Good thing I wasn't an English teacher. In relationship to what we're studying here, how does it relate, going back to my question, through Revelations in regards to those people? Because they're conducting themselves no different than he is.
You mean the people at the banquet? At his banquet here? Or who you're referring to now?
I'm referring to the people that were of the cults.
Oh, the cults, okay.
And what we're reading and understanding from what you're teaching, Nebuchadnezzar was one way, okay? And God made literally an ass of him.
Literally.
Literally. And so then you look at what we're studying this evening, it seems to me that there's a tremendous correlation for what you're bringing in your teachings here.
There's not only a correlation, there's a remarkable contrast. Two kings ruling the same kingdom, having similar power, using it not somewhat differently, both becoming extremely arrogant, one being disciplined until he gets it, and the other one never getting it.
He was never disciplined either, like Nebuchadnezzar.
No, he wasn't in the same way. It's true.
Do you understand why I'm comparing them?
Mm-hmm.
I think you hit the nail right on the head, and that's why I brought it up
Right.
or asked.
Now, interestingly, after Daniel gives the interpretation, they go ahead and put the gold necklace and put the purple garments and give him the third place in the kingdom, okay? And of course, I'm certain that was not overly impressive, since Daniel clearly knew that his third place in the kingdom was going to last a matter of hours, okay? Because the Medes and the Persians are coming, all right? Now,
All the whoops.
yeah. Now, let's read verses 30 and 31, and we will close this tonight. Daniel 5. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. So, what we find, particularly in many histories, the very evening of this message on the wall, Cyrus, through his generals, had his troops divided into two major parts, one upriver and one downriver, of the walls of the city. He then started, of course, the draining process. We drained the water into the canal, into this lake, artificial lake they made. The water level starts to come down, and the downriver side troops wait till it's about hip deep, according to Herodias. Once it gets that low, they literally march right down through the middle of the river. Now, we know for a fact that there were bronze bars that were built partway down in the river. Nobody ever imagined, of course, the Euphrates would only be hip deep at some point. So they didn't extend all the way to the bottom of the riverbed. So they were able to simply go underneath them with that low water and literally had access right into the city. We know the night. It was October 12, 539 BC. We have many historians that constantly repeat that that was the date. Herodias makes a statement that it was a bloodless coup. Josephus says that on the night of the takeover, Daniel is contacted by one of Cyrus's generals, and Daniel literally hands the man the scroll of Isaiah opened to Isaiah chapter 44, verse 27. Why don't you turn back to your left to Isaiah 44. This is what Josephus's account is.
44 what?
44. We're going to look at 27, 28 actually. So 44, 27, 28. So think about this. One of the generals comes to Daniel. He's recognized. Daniel has this scroll of Isaiah open to this place. And here's what he reads to the man. It is I who says to the, I'm sorry, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is I who says to the depth of the sea, be dried up. And I will make your rivers dry. That's rather ironic, isn't it? It is I who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and I will perform all my desire. And he declares of Jerusalem, she will be built, and of the temple, your foundation will be laid. This is what Daniel reads to this man. Okay? Now, Josephus says later that there's a meeting between Daniel and Cyrus. At that point, Daniel apparently reads a little bit further. So go to 45, and we'll read verses 1 through 3 of Isaiah. Thus says the Lord to Cyrus his anointed, whom I have taken by the right hand to subdue nations before him, and to loose the loins of kings, to open doors before him, so that the gates will not be shut. I will go before you and make the rough places smooth. How ironic is this? It's written about 175 years before it happens. I will shatter the doors of bronze and cut through their iron bars, and I will give you the treasures of darkness, the hidden wealth of the secret places, in order that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who calls you by your name. History says that Cyrus was rather impressed by reading this. Okay? Since you realize this was all predicted precisely 175 years before it ever happened. And history says that he was so affected when he read this that that's one of the reasons why he started the policy towards the Jews that he started. Because within about a year, he says, gather up your stuff. I'm going to give you money and transportation, and you're going back to Jerusalem. And that's what Cyrus does. Now, it's interesting, in the British Museum in London, there exists a very famous document, clay document, called the Cyrus Cylinder. And written on it is Cyrus's message about his conquest of Babylon. Now, turn to Ezra chapter 1. So go to your left, past Psalms, past Job, to the book of Ezra chapter 1. We're going to read the first three verses. Now, the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, isn't that an interesting statement?
Mm-hmm.
For a pagan Gentile king to fulfill the word written by the prophet Jeremiah, okay? He says, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation through all his kingdom and also put it in writing. That is literally what the Cyrus cylinder is. It's in the London Museum. Verse 2, thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you, all of his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. This is literally what is said in the Cyrus cylinder. Literally. And it's also recorded here in Ezra chapter 1.
How did the Brits get it?
Archaeological digs of the area. There's a lot of interesting stuff they have in the London Museum, actually. So, we have what the Bible teaches us about what was said and what happened. We have secular history, and of course they agree. Now, Cyrus is written about quite a bit in secular histories. He's spoken of as being brave, thoughtful, intelligent, and a shrewd strategist. He literally expanded the Persian Empire that he inherited from his father. His father's name was Cambyses I. Literally from the Aegean Sea, which would be, he literally conquered from the western part of Turkey, if you can imagine the map, almost to Greece, everything east all the way to the Indus River Valley in India. He conquered up to the Caucasus Mountains. He conquered what would have been the area of the southern and western parts of southern Russia today. He conquered Armenia, He went down further south. He conquered Egypt, obviously Israel. His territory was absolutely vast. It was literally, except for Greece, the size of Alexander's conquest. It's huge. It was almost, a huge part of the known ancient world. In the Middle East, he conquered all of that.
How, in their world of that period, could they manage food and water and supplies and go through battle and do what? It's just difficult to fathom.
It is. And of course, it's one thing to go through the process with an army, as you said, of supplying them for the conquest. But there's an even more difficult part of it in a way, and that is how do you hold on to it? How do you administer it? Because you're talking about a level of manpower that's almost unimaginable. You have to have an enormously large army to control these areas. And of course, eventually, people couldn't do it. Eventually, Cyrus couldn't do it, and his predecessors. Okay. Eventually, the Romans couldn't do it. The conquest of large areas of territory has built-in problems, and even though it's the first of dictators, it also usually ends up ultimately being their demise too. So, now, in 538, Cyrus took the title King of Babylon, but he didn't rule there. Rather, he installed his son, who is named Cambyses II, as vice ruler over the old Babylonian Empire. Now, there is some controversy about what I'm going to tell you. It's not 100% certain, but if you look, go back to Daniel, and you look at chapter 6, verse 1. It says something that's interesting that's been difficult for people to historically completely understand. And it seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they should be in charge of the whole kingdom. So the question is, who's Darius? Well, there have been a couple opinions. I personally think that Darius, because of some records that we have, is another name for Cambyses II, that he's also called Darius. In ancient history, people frequently have multiple names. It's like they have a formal name, then they've got a familiar name, sometimes they have a pet name, you know, and they're kind of used interchangeably. So sometimes it gets a little confusing in the documents because you go, okay, who exactly are they talking about now? But I think probably that's who Darius is. So, conclusion. I want you to turn to the book of Romans, chapter 1. We're going to read a passage that really is pretty familiar. But I want you to think about everything that we've just studied in this chapter. And I want you to think about Belshazzar and his attitude and his nobles' attitudes and how they behaved. So let's read it. I'll read it out loud, starting in verse 18 of Romans 1. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. What did Daniel say to Belshazzar? When he addressed him, he said, yeah, but what did he first say to him? He said, you knew about these things, and you didn't listen. Well, that's the idea of suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. It's not that you don't know it, it's that you won't pay attention to it because your alternate idea or plan or policy is what you advocate, so you won't pay attention to the truth. How common is that in governments? Verse 19, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. Did God show evidence to Belshazzar? Did he show evidence to his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar? Did he show evidence of what he did for the Babylonian kingdom? Okay. You know, was it clear that Nebuchadnezzar, after his 7-year disciplinary period, said, God appoints, the God of heaven and earth appoints who he appoints to rule how he has them rule. That's what Nebuchadnezzar concludes, right? Okay? And it was evident to Nebuchadnezzar that he was a creation of God, and the only reason that he had a right to rule is because God led him. And finally he came to that truth.
Was this after the beast, after the grass?
Yes.
That's when he got woke up.
That's when he got woke up.
That's when most people wake up.
Yes.
Eating the grass?
Okay.
If God rips everything away from them,
Then they wake up.
then
Yes.
they wake up.
Sometimes. All right, verse 20. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been seen clearly, being understood through that which has been made, so that they are without excuse. Do you think that Belshazzar actually thought that the little images of iron and gold and clay and silver that they worship actually were the entities that created everything in the world? I don't think so. I don't think he was that stupid, okay? He was an idolater, but he wasn't that stupid. Verse 21, Romans 1. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God, nor give thanks. Now notice the next part. because they won't honor God like Nebuchadnezzar did at first. But they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. The word there literally means empty, vain, or foolish thinking. Verse 22, professing to be wise. How many rulers profess to be wise? Exactly. They know it all. They've got the plan. They've got the culture. They've got the policies. You know, professing to be wise, they become fools. And they exchange the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and of four-footed animals and crawling creatures, i.e. idolatry. They worship the creation of God, but not Him. Verse 24, therefore God gave them over to the lusts of their hearts to impurity. What was Belshazzar doing that night? That their bodies might be dishonored among them. What was Belshazzar and the group, and the wives and the concubines and the lords and nobles doing that night? For they exchanged the truth of God for, and actually in the Greek here it says the lie. They exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and they worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Now, 500 years after Belshazzar, Paul wrote these words that we just read. But the truth of them were evident with Belshazzar. They were evident 500 years later as Paul wrote them. And they're evident also today. Think of the arrogant lie of the climate warming groups, of the socialist movement, of the globalist advocates, of those that spend all their time creating and worshiping technology, and the transhumanists. What they have in common with each other is one central point. They believe they can control the outcome of the planet. That's what they all have in common with each other.
Well, they got mud all over them today.
They're going to have a whole lot more mud all over them in the future, too.
If you look at that fire up at Paradise and you look at what's going on out there, God has dumped, 8 inches out there? And they're out there just loaded in mud all the way
You know,
to San Francisco.
but you know, as I said, few people seem to learn the lessons of history, and things don't change. Empires become corrupt on empires and fall. Politicians become corrupt politicians and end up losing power eventually. You know, I want to finish by reading these few verses out of the 18th chapter of Revelation. You can just listen if you want to. I'm going to read verses 21 through 24. This is about, interestingly, Babylon, a future Babylon. Okay? Not the one necessarily that is in Iraq, though maybe it will have some part of it being relevant too. But this is a system called Babylon. This is why John calls it Mystery Babylon. It's a worldwide system. Notice what God says. He says, rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her, Babylon. And a strong angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it in the sea, saying, thus will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will not be found any longer. And the sounds of harpists and musicians and flute players and trumpeters will not be heard in you any longer, i.e., all the music you make that's so much fun for yourself is going to come to an abrupt end. And no craftsman of any craft will be found any longer. The ability to produce goods will finally decline and be no more. And the sound of the mill will not be heard in you any longer. Manufacturing the goods that are described in this Mystery Babylon system will come to an end. And the light of a lamp will not shine in you any longer. That's another interesting one. Somehow, light, whether it's through electricity or some other technology, is going to fall into some state in which it cannot be produced in the same way in the future. And he says, and the voice of the bridegroom and bride will not be heard in you any longer. Now, there could be several reasons for that. The way the world's going, I don't know that we're going to have a whole lot of marriages in the future, okay, with, you know, every imaginable version of gender now on the table, okay? And then he says, for your merchants were the great men of the earth, and because all the nations were deceived by your sorcery. In other words, what's behind all this is purely demonic, okay? And, you know, a lot of people in our age think back to the nation we grew up in, and we look at the nation we're in now, and we think, how could it have become this way? But it's the way of all empires. It's human nature. Human nature doesn't change unless God changes it through His providential grace. So, people do what people do. Tyrants do what tyrants do. Rulers do what rulers do. And eventually, the system may start off well, but it becomes ruined because of human nature and because of the absolute unwillingness of those people that run the empire to believe in God and accept Him. So.
And if they would allow God, they'd be accepting of Him. And they would, their kingdom or whatever.